Hello, Soul Focus Group family. This is Martin, and I'm really excited about today's episode. And before we jump in, I wanted to give you all a trigger warning. During this episode, we talk about sexual trauma, early childhood sexual trauma. So I just wanted to make sure that you all knew that before listening further. It is a very powerful, open, and vulnerable conversation between Cindy and myself. And it does get pretty intense around this subject. So I just wanted you all to know before you listened, and whatever decision you make moving forward about whether to listen or not is totally up to you. Just wanted you all to know from a very loving and caring place. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Soul Focused Radio. This is your host, Martin Friedman.
And I'm your host, Cindy Edwards.
Awesome. And it's just the two of us today, Cindy.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It has been
Martina was
two of us for a while.
No, I don't think it has. I was trying to remember the last time that it was just the two of us. And, just to let everybody know, Martina, just due to her work schedule and her, childcare schedule with her baby, she wasn't able to come on tonight. So it's just you and I.
Mm-hmm. We missed you, Martina.
And also, I also like all the different combinations that we have too. Just listening to you and Martina talk, just the two of you last week was really awesome. So I like the different combos that we get with having three co-hosts.
Yeah, it's nice to be able to switch it up. Our listeners too can hear different voices at different times, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And, so much life is happening for all of us that it's always going to be, shifting and changing. So, yeah, I'm excited for this conversation. So just to let listeners know, Cindy, today we'll be introing a series around healing from trauma, which is not a light topic. It's a very heavy topic. And we have several experts with the Soul Focus group. But we have one in particular. Her name is Cindy Carnegie. You're Cindy Edwards. She's Cindy Carnegie. And she'll be joining us next week to really give, a very in-depth professional viewpoint. She's also gone through her own trauma that she'll speak about. So today is really a day for you and I to just sort of get the conversation flowing. And then we'll pick it up in a big way next week.
Sure. I'm excited. I'm excited to have Cindy on and just have this conversation and pick her brain. I've had the chance to meet Cindy when I was in New York last year, and we got to talk a little bit about trauma. And it was a really beautiful and vulnerable conversation, and it was deep. And it was crazy how quickly I was able to connect with her, even though it was my first time meeting her. But I was able to share so much. And so I'm really excited to, speak with her again and continue this conversation.
Well, it doesn't surprise me because both of you have a great vibe. So I definitely can understand why you all connected, and different spelling, but same name too. So,
Yeah.
it was a Cindy thing. The rest of us can't understand. It was a Cindy thing. All right. Cindy Edwards, do you think we should jump into our episode, our intro episode this week?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it.
When you come to the Soul Focus Group, you come to an acknowledgement that there has been injuries done to us from all these different forms of oppression. Injuries that have impacted our subconscious mind, our heart, our spirit, our very soul. So at the Soul Focus Group, we recognize that and we focus on healing. Healing, the return or the recovery of our connections to our healthy self, our beautiful thinking mind. We want you to come join us in a movement of healing all around the world to restore us back to our rightful state. At the Soul Focus Group, we heal.
All right, Martin. Well, I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today. You know, I haven't really had, besides my conversation with Cindy, I've talked a little bit with Dustin around trauma, but I don't really feel like I've had a chance to sit with anybody else and really talk about trauma. Like you said, it's very deep and it's very heavy. So, you know, first off, how would you describe trauma? If somebody were to ask, what is trauma? You know, what is your perspective on that?
You know, I've done a lot of work around trauma. I've done trauma informed work. I've experienced my own trauma and done tons of therapy around it, and, you know, coaching around it and stuff. So that's what I'll be speaking from. That's the experience I'll be speaking from. When Cindy comes on next week, you know, she'll be able to break it down in a much more formal and professional way. But the way I think about trauma is it's any event that happens to you that essentially, what I would say would like leaves a mark on you, leaves a lasting impression, and it's a negative impression. So I should also say that, like, I went through this class when I was 19 years old, which is almost exactly 30 years ago, which is so crazy. But I went through this class on post-traumatic stress disorder, and it was very, very early in the whole discussion around PTSD. And the way that I remember them describing it is it's any event that happens to you that will continue to like replay. It's a negative event. It can be a childhood event, it could be, you know, abuse, it could be witnessing something, you know, as a child, you know, witnessing something horrific. Trauma can be connected to natural disasters. Trauma can be connected to wars. And it doesn't just happen to children, but that's the starting point for a lot of people is around childhood trauma. You know, the thing that I learned, Cindy, when I took this class is that, like, back in the day, psychiatry was all based around Sigmund Freud, like Freudian psychiatry. And Sigmund Freud said that, like, everything that will happen to you later in life will be determined by what happens to you 0 to 5, right? So he's saying that, like, if you have a quote unquote normal childhood 0 to 5, that you're going to have a life where you can pretty much handle anything that comes up. And, you know, what people realized, what psychologists and psychiatrists realize is that that wasn't true, that you can have a so-called normal childhood 0 to 5 and still have like horrific things happen to you after 5 years old that throw you into a traumatic place, the same as if something really bad had happened to you 0 to 5. So Freud is basing everything on, like, you know, your potty training, how you're being treated by your parents. And he's saying that everything that happens later in life will be determined by those first 5 years. Now, we know, you and I both know, you as a mom and somebody that is studying with us at Soul Focus Group about subconscious programming, that 0 to 5 is extremely important in terms of like what we absorb, right, into our subconscious programming in our groundwater. But it's not everything. You can still get trauma as an adult. So you could live a life where you haven't experienced trauma, and then you go through some type of an assault, you go through a natural disaster, you go through a war, or you go through any of these different things, you know, that happen to you as an adult, and that is trauma. What happens is that the negativity of that event stays with you and you keep replaying it. So that's my very like basic, like I didn't look up a definition before we started. That's my very basic non-professional definition as I understand it. It's an event that has so much negative impact on you that it stays with you. You keep replaying it and it keeps impacting you after the event happened. It could be a car accident. It could be so many different things. It could be cancer. Cancer could be traumatic for someone, you know? So that's my understanding of trauma.
Yeah. What it's almost sounding like is trauma it could almost be subjective, right? Something that might happen to somebody and affect them in a certain way might not affect another person the same way that it affected. You know, I feel like it can be very subjective, you know. This is deep. It's a very deep topic.
It really is. Absolutely. So, like, we know, for example, that 2 children can be in a very abusive household and one child gets impacted a certain way by that abuse and in a way that the other one doesn't.
Yeah.
That could be a lot of factors,
Right.
And like when we talk to Cindy next week, we can really sit down with her around this. Like, how can two people grow up in the same home dealing with the same things and come out so differently? So certainly some of that might be personality. Some of that, I mean, it could be so many different things that come to my mind. I know that, like, for many of us, like my brother and I went through the same situations in many ways. And we have reacted and processed it so differently over the course of our lives. I think that the trauma itself is not subjective, but it's the impact that it has on you that might be seen as subjective. So I don't think, Cindy, the trauma is what's subjective. I think if you're in a bad car accident, it's traumatic. If you are assaulted in any way, that's a traumatic event. I think another way to think about it is like if if something happens to you physically, like if you break your leg, that's a traumatic event on your body, right? But people will heal differently and the long-lasting effects will be different. But nobody would argue that a broken leg doesn't traumatize your body.
Right.
Right. So if 2 people or 3 people or 10 people or 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 go through the same thing, it doesn't mean that they're all going to have the same impact in terms of what happens, with post-traumatic stress. And I think it's important to say that everyone still went through the trauma. So it's as I understand it, it's still trauma. It's just how you process it that's going to be subjective and different.
Yes. And I agree. I think that's what I was trying to say was there's trauma, and then the way it impacts people and the way people process it can be subjective. Because I feel like I've had conversations with people where I brought up something that happened to me, and they're like, "Yeah, that happened to me too," but the way that they processed it, like it kind of just wasn't that big of a deal to them as to how I had processed it to me, where it was, like you said, a negative mark and, something that I replay over and over.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm glad we got to clarify that together, Cindy, because the reason why I was pretty adamant about saying it is because the person who's not impacted as strongly by the same trauma often diminishes the experience of the person that is impacted really strongly. And that's why we have to say that it's trauma, period. The way you, and also sometimes the people that say, and this is my experience, and we can unpack this even more as we go along the series, but it's also my experience where people will say that they're not impacted, but you can look at their life and see that they really are. You know what I mean? Like if something happened in terms of like sexual assault to a child or to an adult, you may be able to see patterns in that person's relationships later on. They might say, "Oh, I healed from it. I'm good." But I think we can look at patterns in people's lives, even if they say, "I'm good, it wasn't that big of a deal." And I picked that particular subject because I think it's something that shows up for a lot of people in relationships, and it's a way you can sort of see it moving forward. But it could be any type of trauma. So people might say it wasn't that big of a deal. And that might be on a conscious level. But I think it's important to ask that person, well, can you identify patterns that might have come from that trauma that maybe weren't there before, or maybe would be different if you hadn't experienced that trauma? So even a lot of times when people say it's no big deal, I handled it, I don't know why you're still obsessing on it. That doesn't mean they've really processed it. It just means they feel like they processed it on a conscious level.
Yeah, I agree. And now I'm thinking about it, I'm like, it does kind of diminish the other person's experience, or I guess the way that they process it. Because when it happened to me, I was like, oh, then it just kind of made me reevaluate. Like, maybe it just made me think that I didn't fully heal from it yet. And so I was like, that person must be healed. That's why it just doesn't seem like that big of a deal to them versus me. I don't think I've healed from this traumatic experience. And, to be completely honest with you, I feel like now that we've talked about this topic, I think about the events that have happened in my life, but I never looked at it as trauma. I never sat down and was like, that was traumatic, or that is somewhere that is trauma for me. I never really sat down and thought about my traumatic, I guess, experiences. So that's something that, I'm really excited to unpack next week when we have our conversation with Cindy. Do you get what I'm saying? I feel like a lot has happened to me, but I don't look at it as if it's trauma to me, even though it does have a negative effect on me. And I do replay it sometimes. Maybe I'm in denial that like I've been, affected, or, I think the word trauma is just very powerful and deep. And maybe that's something that I've kind of just never really, I've kind of shied away from and was kind of scared to sit and unpack the trauma.
Yeah. And, one question I have for you is, do you feel like, is some of that cultural? Like in your family and in your culture, how is trauma dealt with?
One word that I feel is really prevalent in my culture is resilience. I feel like in my culture, we pride ourselves on being resilient, on going through whatever we go through. And when I think about it, when I remember like I would share things that would upset me, and I don't really feel like it was acknowledged the way that I felt about it. My feelings weren't really acknowledged. It was kind of like, you're okay. You're okay. Every time, you bring something, you're okay. You'll be fine. You're tough. Don't cry. It was very uncomfortable for my caregivers to see me crying, I feel like. And so then eventually I felt like I kind of just stopped whatever I was going through. I kind of just stopped sharing it because I felt like I was just going to get the same sort of response every time. But yeah, when I think about it culturally, like I feel like, my mom has went through a lot of trauma. Like she had shared a story about, living in Cambodia during the genocide, the Khmer Rouge. And she shared a story where, she had to pack up her belongings and walk on foot trying to find refuge in Vietnam. And so they were traveling, and she was sharing how she was pregnant with one of my sisters and was carrying my other sister on her back, and she was trading, like her gold for bags of rice. And she just basically showed the story where had she not made it to Vietnam, she would have died in the genocide because they stopped at a camp. But then she saw a relative who was on their way to Vietnam. And so she joined her relatives instead of staying at that camp, because eventually that camp, everyone there had passed away. But I don't think my mom views that as trauma, and the way she told the story, she just seemed like she was fine. And maybe she wasn't. And I was too young to even ask her, like, how she felt or if she was scared. I was just more interested in the story of her traveling to Vietnam, to another country on foot, and trading her belongings for, rice and blankets and clothing for my sisters. So, it's just interesting to think about that, because I think in her eyes, like she was able to survive and was resilient, from that experience.
I'm gonna make sure to play this for Cindy, our guest next week, and I want her to talk to you about whether she thinks that was a traumatic event for your mom or not. And I think that what you're starting to uncover, which is really powerful, is the trauma is not just what happens to us, but it's also generational, and we feel the effects of the trauma that happens to our previous generations. And also we inherit how they deal with trauma. And so I think what you said about you questioning events in your life, whether they were actually trauma or not, after you tell me that story, it makes a lot of sense why you would question that.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's true for a lot of folks. I mean, my family, it's a generation different. But when I hear what my grandfather went through, who was, born in this country and had to support his family at 6 years old. And when he described a lot of what he went through, that was traumatic to him, but he never framed it as trauma either. There's a level of immigrant experience, and I know what his parents went through before they left, Europe as Jewish people. So there's this generational trauma, that we're going to talk about. It's not just healing from trauma in our own lives, but it's also healing from generational trauma. And that's definitely going to be part of what we cover in this series.
One of the biggest fallacies there is in the social justice movement is the idea that integration happened. And I know that in a lot of Black and brown households, we have a story that we tell, and that is integration is what really destroyed our community. At the Soul Focus Group, we say, no, that's not true. Integration never really happened. Desegregation happened. We moved from segregation to desegregation, which was the moving of Black and brown bodies into white spaces, but our consciousness was never invited. And true integration cannot happen unless you invite a person's consciousness into the circle. Cultural integration is absolutely necessary in order to have true integration. At the Soul Focus Group, we bring everybody's cultural consciousness, everybody's cultural intelligence into the circle. We respect it, we honor it, because we know it has a purpose, powerful purpose. Come join us at the Soul Focus Group. Integrated consciousness is powerful.
Cindy, I want to go back to something that you said earlier, and you talked about the concept of healing fully, right, from trauma. And, first of all, even identifying whether something is trauma to know that we are to heal from it, right? And, one of the things I wanted to say during this introduction is I wanted to talk about what is the definition of healing. I have a lot of different feelings about this. For a long time, I felt like, healed is something that is like a place you can arrive at, right? Like, oh, I can be healed one day fully. And then over time, I've actually come to see and believe that it's just about being in a healing process, and that where I want to be in my life is a continually healing process. And I want to continue to grow and move forward and not stay stuck in the same place. And I'm less I don't really believe so much anymore in the concept of a healed place where I'm completely healed. Well, I guess I want to know what you think about that first before I get into the other, to the definition.
I agree. Hearing you explain that concept, I agree 100%. And I'll share this when we have our conversation with Cindy, but there's some experiences that has happened, or some events that have happened in my life, and I thought I was healed because I stopped thinking about it. The emotions didn't really come up for me anymore. But then, like you said, it would be like 6 months down the line and something kind of triggered me. And then I felt, I thought about that event, and I thought about the emotions that came up. And so, yeah, I agree 100%. I don't think being fully healed is, how would I describe that? I believe that it's a process still, and it's an ongoing process.
Yeah. And that's not a bad thing, right? Like, it's a good thing.
No, yeah.
It means you can live like a really good quality life. But I think a lot of people, and the part of the thing is, like we always talk about, Cindy, we always talk about the idea of groundwater and subconscious programming. So we can feel healed on a conscious level. But then again, like we talked about earlier, let's look for patterns, right? So we might say, oh, I feel good. I don't think about that thing anymore. But our patterns coming up in our relationships, in how we treat ourselves. So I've shared several times on this podcast, especially though I think just the old version, not our new version, but I've shared many times that that I was a victim of sexual abuse when I was a very small child. What I remember happened about 4 or 5, 6 years old, but and then stopped around 6. But also I know things happened to me younger than that too. So when I think about my healing journey on this, what I think about is that, like, that event or those events will never have not happened to me, right? They will always have happened to me. But the healing journey is, I'm more interested now in the patterns that were put in place that were survival for me, right? What do you do it when you're a little kid and you go through something like that? You put patterns of defensiveness, patterns of anger, different patterns that are put into place, and maybe lack of intimacy, lack of trust. And so for me, the healing journey is, the way we describe it at Soul Focus Group, is a return to like your true self. That healing is you being measured against you, not anybody else. And that speaks to our conversation earlier. Like, we don't experience trauma the same. We're not impacted in the same. We can go through the exact same event. We'll have a different perspective and we'll have different impacts. But our definition of healing says that the healing process will be in relationship to you, not to anybody else.
Yeah.
So healing is returning to your what we would say optimal functioning, right? So when I think about my own healing journey from what I went through as a very young child, it is to get back to that essence of who I am before that happened to me. And also to take away the triggers that come up from those events, that even at 59 years old, I can still act from that place sometimes. And healing to me is creating new patterns of behavior, not acting from that place anymore, not spending time wishing something hadn't happened to me. And instead of spending time wishing something hadn't happened, being able to really look at the impacts and the effects and the patterns, and understanding that I don't need the same survival patterns now that I did when I was that age. And that's to me what a healing process really looks like.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Martin, for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot to unpack and a lot to process, because, I myself, when I was younger, had dealt with sexual abuse. And it's interesting, it's not interesting, but it's crazy that you said that. I was pretty young too. I was around, I would say maybe 4. And from what I could remember, it stopped at 6 when I was old enough to really understand that this is weird, and so then I was able to avoid those people that were abusing me. But at the same time, I feel like it happened even when I was younger too, before the age of 4, but it's kind of crazy. It's so hazy because I can't remember myself at 2, 3, at 2 and 3 years old, but my body remembers it.
Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate your vulnerability and your bravery in sharing that, and the impacts of that happening to a child, especially when, as a mom, kids the ages we're talking about, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, are looking to their caregivers, their caretakers, to protect them, because, you can't really protect yourself from very much when you're that age, right? And so the patterns that get put into place around trust, around expectations of how people will treat you, there are patterns that get put into place that are essential for that child to, feel okay about their lives. But there's an impact that happens to us, later on. And it may not be conscious, but it's existing at least in the subconscious mind, in the groundwater, as we talk about it. And usually we can find patterns in our relationships that are rooted in what happened to us, whatever age it was. Usually we can find those patterns. And when we identify those patterns, we realize, oh, I don't have to think about it all the time. I don't have to obsess about it all the time. I don't have to replay it all the time to have it still impact me. And the healing process is being able to reconnect with that, the innocence of that child before that child went through things that a child should never have to go through. And, that to me is the healing, is acknowledging the pain, acknowledging the impact, and then understanding that we're not that child anymore, and that we're not going through that thing anymore, and that now we can create a different reality for ourselves. We don't have to stay in those same patterns. And for me, with everything I've gone through, I've lived a lot more life than you have. I think I've lived about almost twice as much life as you've lived. And I mean, I've been through, my family put us in therapy when I was like a single digit kid. And I went through all this therapy, but it was never for the right thing until finally later in life, around 40, like I actually realized, oh, this is what I really needed to be in therapy for all this time. And I was in a lot of bad therapy that was ineffective because it was dealing with the impacts of what had happened to me, but not allowing me to go back, understand it, feel it. And then, even after that therapy, I still had to like get with my D as a coach to be able to understand that I can reshape my own reality and take control of it. So that's the journey that I've been on around it. And I think the main thing I want to say to you is, first of all, I'm sorry that happened to you, and thank you for sharing. And also that, this is, everything happens for a reason. This is an opportunity for you to be able to unpack, these events in your life through a different lens and, start to make choices to make sure that these are patterns that aren't going to continue, because generally you can trace abuse to people who were abused. And I know that's true in my family. I know that both my mom and my dad were sexually abused. Mm-hmm. And I know that it got passed down generationally, So this is an opportunity for us. That's another way I would personally define healing, is I would also personally define it as breaking cycles, because healing isn't just for us. You're also healing for your children.
Yeah.
You're healing to make sure that you're doing everything you can to create this healthy environment for your children, that you're not passing down that generational trauma. You're doing everything you can to minimize the impacts of passing down that generational trauma.
Right. Yeah. I do see how it shows up in not the way that I parent, but it shows up for me now that I have my own children. I do feel like I have trust issues with other people around my children. Almost kind of like I have like a detachment issue. Like I'm scared. I don't really drop my kids off anywhere except for, my in-laws or my parents, or people that I really, really, really trust. And so, I see how that shows up for me, and there's been instances where I've shared with Kelly, my husband, how this is showing up for me, in certain situations where I feel uncomfortable around certain adults or even kids. And so I'm like, am I projecting my own trauma onto this child, or is something here not really looking right? And I had to ask Kelly because I wasn't sure if I was projecting, my own traumatic experiences. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk some more and unpack
Me too.
all of this with Cindy. So
Me too. Well, this is a hell of a way to introduce it, right? I think we both thought it was going to be a little lighter, didn't we?
Definitely, yeah. I'm feeling like heaviness in my chest a little bit right now, and that's just I just want to share my accurate location right now. This is heavy for me.
Yeah. I understand. It is for me too. I've also spent a lot more time talking about it and processing it, I think, than you have. And I've also shared before on this podcast. So I think I'm definitely in a different place. And also I can totally relate and feel what you're going through. So Cindy, I really want to thank you again. And I know I've just said it, but I just want to thank you for your bravery and your openness. Cause it's a hard thing to say when you know that there's a public aspect to this. So yeah, I just want to thank you for this conversation. It's been a really awesome conversation, and I can't wait for what's going to come next when we have Cindy on and other folks as well.
Well, thank you, Martin, for providing such a safe space, for me to feel comfortable enough to share this, and to all of our listeners, thank you for sharing space with me and just letting me be vulnerable. And this is a part of my healing journey, being able to talk about it and unpack it and address it, and then figure out how to create new patterns that will serve me in the life that I want to live for myself and, for my loved ones.
Beautifully said. All right, Cindy. Well, thank you so much. And we'll be back in a minute to close out this episode.
Sounds good.
My genius, my power, my optimal functioning. My genius, my power, my optimal functioning. Repeat after me. My genius, my power, my optimal functioning. That is the jingle of the Soul Focus Group, because we are dedicated to helping you recover your genius, your power, and your optimal functioning. We want you to recognize the unique way that you comprehend things, express yourself, experience, and create in the world. We want to help you recover your genius, your power, your optimal functioning.
All right, Cindy. Well, we've taken a little break, and just transparency for our listeners. We spent the last few minutes just kind of talking and decompressing from the conversation that we just had. And I've already thanked you a few times, but I'm going to thank you again. And I want to check in with you because before we stop, the recording, you talked about a heaviness in your chest. And I just really want to check in with you and just see how you're feeling in your body and just how you're feeling right now.
Right now I feel a lot better after decompressing and having that conversation with you. And I'm just taking deep breaths, and my chest is not feeling as heavy anymore. I feel good. I'm really excited from our conversation next week. I feel like it's time for me to start my healing journey. So although it was, heavy, I think I will benefit a lot from this, as we continue to unpack everything.
And Cindy, I think our listeners are going to benefit a lot from, being on this journey with you, with me, with all of us, and just us being candid and vulnerable. And I would first of all say, I think you've already been on the healing journey. I don't think you're starting it with this series of podcasts. I know you've already been on it, and this is just going to take your healing journey to another level. You've brought people into your life that are going to help you take this healing to another level. So the healing's already been going on for you. And now's an opportunity for it to continue to enable your growth.
Yeah.
I also want to say to you, that I strongly encourage you to take some time before you just jump back in your life, with your kids and your husband, and, just, I don't know what you could do, but just do something for yourself to decompress, sit quietly, take a little walk, whatever it is that you would want to do, just to give yourself a transition, back to being Cindy, the super mom, just let yourself transition a little bit, let yourself feel what you're feeling. And I would also say to our listeners the same thing. This could be very heavy and very triggering for you all. And I encourage you to bring some transition into your lives too, before you just jump back into whatever it is you were planning to do next after listening to this. Especially if you have gone through something similar to what Cindy and I have gone through as small children. Take some time and, feel what you need to feel, and make sure that you honor a transition to whatever you're doing next. That is my ask, Cindy, for you and also for our listeners.
Thank you, Martin.
You're welcome. So this is just the beginning of this conversation. It's a continuation of all of our healing journeys, including you all that are listening to us right now. Know that we love you and care about you. As Cindy said earlier, we love you, and we love that you are listening to us and listening to us be vulnerable and open about what's happened in our lives. We want you to be a part of everything that we do. So please visit our website, soulfocusgroup.com. Listen to podcasts. If you haven't listened to other podcasts, please go back and listen, and just be a part of our family, which is a family that's based not on dysfunction, and abuse, but it's a family that we're growing and building that's based on love and trust and growing and healing together. So with that, everyone, we ask, as always, that you stay safe, you stay well, and most of all, stay soul
focused.
focused.